A woman named Mrs. Gable, whose smile never quite reached her eyes, had called it a fixer-upper with historical character. Chris had called it cheap. At 32, fresh off a bitter divorce and drowning in freelance deadlines, cheap was the only adjective that mattered. The house sat at the absolute dead end of Hemlock Lane, a narrow, unpaved road that wound its way up into the dense, brooding hills behind the township. There were no streetlights here. The forest pressed in from all sides, a tangled mass of towering hemlock trees whose dense canopy swallowed the daylight long before the sun actually set. Their needle-strewn branches cast long, skeletal shadows across the peeling white paint of the porch. The previous owner left rather abruptly, Mrs. Gable had muttered, sliding the brass key across the warped floorboards of the foyer. Just packed light. Don't mind the cellar door. The latch is old. It rattles in the draft. Chris had unpacked his boxes over the first week. The house was cavernous, drafty, and smelled faintly of damp earth and crushed pine needles. But it was quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. There was no hum of highway traffic, no distant sirens, only the deep, rhythmic creaking of the hemlocks swaying against each other in the wind, sounding unsettlingly like shifting bones. By the second week, the quiet began to curdle. It started on a Tuesday night. A heavy, suffocating fog had rolled in off the valley, blanketing the yard and pressing flat against the double-paned glass of Chris's ground-floor study. Chris was typing furiously, trying to finish an article before midnight, when he heard it. Thump. It came from beneath the floorboards, a dull, rhythmic impact, like a heavy bag of grain shifting in the dark. Chris stopped typing, his fingers hovering over the keys. Thump. Thump. Pause. Thump. Old house settling, he muttered to himself, forcing a hollow laugh. The floor joists were undoubtedly rotting. He stood up, stretching his stiff back, and walked into the hallway. The air near the basement door was noticeably colder, carrying a sharp, metallic tang, like wet pennies or fresh blood. He reached out and touched the iron ring of the cellar latch. It was ice cold. As his fingers brushed the metal, the sound below shifted. It wasn't a thump anymore. It was a wet, dragging scuff, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic clicking noise, like long fingernails tapping rapidly against dried wood. Chris yanked his hand back as if he'd been burned. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing thin and fragile down the empty corridor. The sound stopped instantly. In their place came an overwhelming, suffocating silence, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, as if something down there was holding its breath to listen back. The next morning, driven by a restless unease, Chris decided to walk down Hemlock Lane to introduce himself to the only other property on the road, a dilapidated cabin about a half-mile back down the hill. The walk was eerie. The fog had cleared, but the hemlocks still dripped cold condensation onto his jacket. The forest floor was completely devoid of wildlife. No squirrels chattered, no birds sang. It was a dead zone of green and gray. When he reached the cabin, he realized it wasn't lived in. The windows were boarded over with thick, weathered planks, and the porch was choked with briars. A rotting wooden sign hung crookedly from a rusted nail by the front door, half swallowed by ivy. The faded paint read, "Hemlock Lane Residency Act, 1954. Chris frowned, checking his phone. No service. He turned back toward the cabin door, noticing something carved deep into the warped cedar wood near the handle. It wasn't graffiti. It looked ancient, hacked out with a dull blade. A sudden chill swept through the clearing, making the hairs on the back of Chris's arms stand at attention. He spun around, convinced he heard footsteps crunching on pine needles behind him. The path was empty. But as he looked up into the canopy, he saw something that made his stomach drop. High above, suspended between the interwoven branches of the giant hemlocks, were dark, elongated shapes. They swayed gently in the breeze, wrapped tightly in thick, gray webbing that looked suspiciously like spun bark. Chris didn't walk back to his house, he ran. That night, the house seemed to shrink around him. The walls groaned, expanding and contracting with the sudden drop in temperature. Chris sat at his desk, with all the lights in the house blazing, but the antique bulbs flickered and dimmed, casting long, writhing silhouettes across the wallpaper. At precisely 3:03 a.m., the power cut out entirely. Total, absolute darkness swallowed the rooms. Chris fumbled in his pocket for his phone, using the flashlight beam to cut a trembling path through the hallway. As the light swept past the basement door, he stopped dead. The heavy iron latch was lifting. Slowly, inch by inch, the rusted metal bar rose, pushed from the inside. There was no sound of a struggle, no metallic screech, just a smooth, oily slide. "No," Chris whispered, backing away until his spine hit the opposite wall. "No way." The cellar door swung wide open, spilling a wave of thick, cloying fog into the hallway. A fog that smelled overwhelmingly of crushed pine, turned earth, and something sickeningly sweet, like decaying fruit. From the darkness of the stairs came the clicking sound again, faster now, hundreds of tiny, frantic taps, accompanied by a low, wet rustling sound, like branches dragging across gravel. Chris raised his phone, pointing the beam down the yawning, black abyss of the basement stairs. The light caught something at the base of the landing. It was pale, elongated, and impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally jointed like the twisted branches of the hemlock trees outside. It had no face, only smooth, gray bark-like skin stretched tightly over a skull-shaped hollow, and deep within its chest cavity, visible through a split in its fibrous ribcage, a mass of thick black roots pulsed with a sickening, rhythmic beat. Thousands of fine, hair-like rootlets spilled from its fingertips, trailing across the concrete floor as it began to ascend the stairs, stretching toward the light. Chris didn't scream. Panic locked his throat. He turned and sprinted toward the front door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He threw himself against the heavy oak door, grabbing the deadbolt. He twisted it, but it wouldn't turn. He looked down in horror. Thick, fibrous vines had burst through the wood grain around the frame, wrapping around the lock in a suffocating grip. They were pulsing with that same slow, rhythmic heartbeat. Footsteps, light, numerous, and impossibly fast, scuttled up the hallway behind him. Chris spun around just as the darkness engulfed him. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers, the flashlight beam bouncing once against the floorboards before winking out entirely. In the pitch black, the forest outside groaned in unison, a chorus of bending timber and snapping branches, celebrating a full house once again. And then the quiet returned to Hemlock Lane, deep, permanent, and undisturbed.